The real reason the US wants Canada, the coming water war. While politicians argue over trade deals and border security, something far more desperate is unfolding beneath the surface of American life. Something nobody wants to talk about. Something that makes oil look like a luxury problem. The American Southwest is dying of thirst, and the clock is ticking faster than anyone dares to admit. Look at Lake Mead from above. What you see isn't a lake anymore. It's a graveyard of cracked earth, stretching for miles where water once stood 200 feet deep. The white calcium rings on the canyon walls tell the story of a slow-motion catastrophe. Each ring marks another year of decline. Another year closer to the point of no return. This isn't a drought. Droughts end. This is the new reality. Deep beneath the Great Plains, the Ogallala Aquifer is being drained at a terrifying pace. In Kansas alone, the water table dropped a full foot in just 1 year. Picture that. 12 inches of ancient water, accumulated over thousands of years, gone in 12 months. The gap between what nature puts back and what we're taking out isn't just troubling. It's catastrophic. This aquifer irrigates 30% of American farmland. When it dies, the breadbasket dies with it. But the Ogallala is just one piece of the puzzle. The real emergency is happening right now along the Colorado River. 40 million Americans depend on this river for drinking water. Cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles. Vast stretches of California farmland. All of it hanging by a thread that's getting thinner every single day. There's a term engineers use that most people have never heard. Deadpool. It sounds like a movie, but it's the nightmare scenario keeping water managers awake at night. Deadpool is the point where reservoir levels drop so low that water can no longer flow downstream. The system doesn't just get strained. It stops working entirely. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are both racing toward this threshold. When they hit it, the taps don't just slow down. They shut off. The Colorado River used to reach Mexico. Used to feed wetlands and communities across the border. Now, it dies in the desert, miles before the border. The river literally disappears into dry sand. Walk along certain stretches and you'll find nothing but dust where a mighty river once carved canyons. 7 states are locked in an impossible battle over what little water remains. Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. Each one bound by agreements made nearly a century ago, when the river flowed strong and nobody imagined it could fail. Those agreements divided up more water than the river actually carries. The math never worked. Now the system is collapsing, and the federal government is stepping in with increasingly desperate measures. Mandatory cuts. Emergency declarations. None of it is enough. The question nobody wants to ask out loud is simple and terrifying. What happens when 40 million Americans turn on their faucets and nothing comes out? The answer might be found in a place most Americans never think about. Canada. Fly over the Canadian wilderness and you'll see something that looks almost obscene when you remember what's happening just south of the border. Water. Endless, pristine, abundant water. Lakes that stretch to the horizon. Rivers that dwarf anything left in the American West. James Bay alone contains more freshwater than most countries will see in a lifetime. Canada holds 20% of the world's freshwater supply. 20%. For a population of just 40 million people. Do the math. 335 million Americans are running out of water. 40 million Canadians are sitting on an ocean of it. More water than they could use in 1,000 years. Right next door. This isn't a new observation. For 60 years, engineers and planners have been drawing up schemes. Massive projects that would make the Hoover Dam look like a backyard swimming pool. Projects that were designed, calculated, costed, and presented to governments. Projects that never quite went away, even when they were officially shelved. The first major plan was called NAWAPA. The North American Water and Power Alliance. Proposed in the 1960s, it was audacious beyond belief. The idea was to divert rivers in the Yukon, build massive dam systems across British Columbia, create reservoirs in the Rocky Mountain Trench, and send that water south through a network of aqueducts stretching across the entire continent. California, Arizona, Texas, all the way to Mexico. The scale was staggering. Bigger than the interstate highway system. More expensive than putting a man on the moon. The projected costs were astronomical even then. Translate those numbers to today's dollars and you're looking at investments that would rival the entire annual federal budget. But here's the thing. The project wasn't abandoned because it was impossible. It was shelved because Canada refused to cooperate. Because environmental groups raised alarms. Because the political will wasn't there. Yet. The plans still exist. The engineering is sound. The route is mapped. NAWAPA wasn't killed. It was put on pause. Then there was the Grand Canal scheme. The Great Recycling and Northern Development Plan. This one was even more ambitious in some ways. The idea was to dam James Bay entirely, converting a massive saltwater inlet into a freshwater reservoir. Nuclear-powered pump stations would push that water south into the Great Lakes, and from there, into the United States. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. 160 million acre-feet of water per year. Enough to refill Lake Mead 8 times over. Enough to end the American water crisis for generations. Canadian politicians looked at these proposals and said no. Absolutely not. Our water is not for sale. Indigenous communities protested the destruction of their traditional lands. Environmental groups warned of ecological catastrophe. The Grand Canal joined NAWAPA in the filing cabinet of dreams deferred. But notice the language. Deferred. Not cancelled. Not impossible. Just waiting. Because Canada said no. But what happens when no stops being an option? The mechanism for change already exists. Most people don't realize how fragile Canada's position actually is. On paper, Canada has strong protections against bulk water exports. Federal and provincial laws explicitly ban it. The Great Lakes Compact, signed by 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces, carefully restricts diversions. Everything seems locked down tight. But trade law is a funny thing. It has loopholes big enough to float a supertanker through. Under USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, water is treated specially. As long as water remains in its natural state, it's protected. Canada can say this is our resource, not a commodity, and trade rules don't apply. But the moment water becomes a commercial product, everything changes. Bottle it, and suddenly it's a tradable good. Sell 1 drop across the border, and the proportionality clause kicks in. That clause says if you're exporting a resource, you can't later restrict that export without offering the same restrictions to domestic users. In other words, once the tap is turned on, it can't be turned off. There's already precedent for this. In 2016, the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin got approval to divert water from Lake Michigan. It was pitched as a special case. A small exception. Just enough to supply a single city's drinking water. The Great Lakes Compact allowed it under strict conditions. But every exception sets a precedent. Every special case becomes the justification for the next one. The wall has a crack in it now. How long before that crack becomes a flood? Trade tribunals could force Canada's hand without a single shot being fired. If American corporations argue that water restrictions violate trade agreements, international panels could rule in their favor. Canadian sovereignty could be overridden by trade law. It sounds absurd until you remember how these systems actually work. Corporations have successfully sued governments for environmental regulations that hurt their profits. Why would water be any different? Then there's what happened in 2020. Water became a tradable commodity on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. You can now buy and sell water futures the same way you trade oil or wheat or pork bellies. Wall Street is already circling. Investment firms are buying up water rights across the American West, betting that scarcity will drive prices through the roof. When water is traded like oil, the market dynamics become identical. And markets always find a way to access supply. Drive through parts of California and you'll see farmland with for sale signs. Not because the farmers want to sell. Because the water rights attached to that land are worth more than a lifetime of crops. Private equity is buying up these rights, consolidating control, waiting for the price to spike. Water is being financialized. Once the process is complete, the pressure to access Canadian supplies becomes irresistible. Because money doesn't care about borders or sovereignty. Money flows toward profit. But the real lever isn't economic. It's existential. Imagine Phoenix in 5 years. 5 million people facing severe water rationing. Lawns are illegal. Showers are timed. Businesses are relocating. Property values are collapsing. Now imagine Las Vegas. 2 million people in a desert city built entirely on borrowed water. When Lake Mead hits Deadpool, Vegas doesn't just suffer. It becomes uninhabitable. Now imagine the Central Valley of California, the most productive agricultural region in America, turning to dust. Food prices spiking. Supply chains breaking. Economic catastrophe spreading across the country. At what point does this stop being a trade issue and become a national security crisis? History teaches us that when populations face genuine resource scarcity, governments act. They don't ask permission. They don't wait for market solutions. They do what's necessary for survival. Water stops being a commodity and becomes a strategic imperative. The friendly neighbor to the north suddenly looks different through that lens. Not as a partner, but as the holder of something America desperately needs. When millions are thirsty, when cities are dying, when the economy is crumbling, how long do treaties and agreements really hold? How long before a strategic necessity becomes inevitable? The escalation is already underway. Most people just aren't paying attention. Over the past 2 years, there have been quiet but significant increases in talks between American and Canadian officials about water security. Not loud public debates. Quiet technical discussions. Infrastructure studies examining the feasibility of cross-border water projects. Private sector deals in border regions, testing the limits of what's legally possible. The language is shifting too. Political rhetoric that used to talk about respecting Canadian sovereignty now emphasizes North American cooperation. Partnership. Shared resources for shared prosperity. Think tanks are publishing papers with titles like Rethinking Continental Water Policy. The frame is being built. The narrative is being prepared. When the crisis becomes undeniable, the solution will already be packaged and ready. There are already small cross-border water diversions that most people don't know about. Precedents that seem minor now but establish the principle that water can flow north to south when needed. Each one makes the next one easier to justify. Canada is caught in an impossible position. The country's economy is deeply intertwined with America's. Trade relationships, defense partnerships, cultural connections. Saying no to the United States on a matter of genuine crisis carries enormous risks. But saying yes means surrendering control over the most valuable resource of the 21st century. It means setting a precedent that could echo globally. If Canada's water can be claimed by a more powerful neighbor in need, what does that mean for water-rich nations everywhere? The Canadian provinces are divided. Alberta has different interests than Quebec. British Columbia's perspective differs from Ontario's. Some see opportunity in water exports. Others see a threat to sovereignty that cannot be tolerated. Indigenous communities, whose rights to water are constitutionally protected, are being pulled into the center of a geopolitical struggle they never asked for. Their water rights could become leverage. A way to bypass federal resistance. Most Canadians, when polled, oppose bulk water exports. The public sentiment is clear. This is our water. It stays here. But public opinion has a way of shifting when pressure is applied from enough directions at once. Economic incentives. Political maneuvering. And if necessary, crisis rhetoric. When the American government declares a genuine national emergency over water, when the media shows images of American children unable to get clean drinking water, how long does Canadian resolve last? They won't invade. They won't need to. The pressure will come from 3 directions simultaneously. Economic leverage through trade agreements and financial incentives or penalties. Political pressure through diplomatic channels and partnership frameworks. And emergency powers, invoked during crisis scenarios, that override normal procedures. It's a vice grip. And it's tightening. The timeline isn't distant future speculation. This is happening now. By 2035, the projections are stark. The most likely scenario isn't a dramatic announcement of a new NAWAPA-style megaproject. It's gradual commercial agreements. Starting small. A city here, a region there. Temporary emergency measures that quietly become permanent. Exceptions that expand until they're the rule. The water starts flowing south in amounts too small to protest effectively. Then those amounts grow. Precedent by precedent. Agreement by agreement. Climate change is accelerating faster than even the pessimistic models predicted. Droughts that were supposed to be once-in-a-century events are happening every few years now. The Colorado River Basin is in a megadrought that has lasted more than 2 decades. Scientists are increasingly using a new term. Aridification. Not a temporary drought, but a permanent shift to a drier climate. The Southwest is becoming a different place. And populations are still growing. Phoenix and Las Vegas are among the fastest-growing metros in America. The demand side of the equation only moves in one direction. Up. What does this mean? For Canadian sovereignty, it means a test unlike anything the country has faced in modern history. For North American geopolitics, it means the power balance shifts in ways that ripple through every other policy area. For water as a global commodity, it means the precedent set here will be watched and copied everywhere. India and Pakistan, locked in conflict over glacier-fed rivers. The Middle East, where water scarcity drives more conflict than oil ever did. Africa, where entire regions face catastrophic shortages. If America can claim Canadian water through legal and economic pressure, every water-rich nation on Earth becomes vulnerable. Indigenous rights hang in the balance too. Treaties that protect native control over traditional water sources could be the last line of defense, or they could be bargained away in backroom deals. Environmental ecosystems that depend on free-flowing rivers could be sacrificed for human need. The ecological cost of massive diversions would be severe. Salmon runs destroyed. Wetlands dried up. Entire watersheds fundamentally altered. This is the blueprint for 21st century resource conflict. Not armies crossing borders. Not tanks and missiles. Just lawyers, trade agreements, financial pressure, and the slow, grinding logic of necessity. The infrastructure is already designed. The legal frameworks exist. The crisis is accelerating with every passing year. The taps are running dry in the American Southwest. Lake Mead drops lower every summer. The Ogallala Aquifer continues its death spiral. 40 million people are depending on a river that's disappearing. And just across the border, Canadian rivers flow heavy with water nobody is using. When Las Vegas faces Deadpool, will Canada be able to say no? When Phoenix rations water to 1 hour a day, will sovereignty matter more than crisis? When American farms collapse and food prices spike, will trade agreements hold? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is hydrology. Economics. History. The patterns are clear for anyone willing to look. The water war isn't coming. It's already here. The only question left is how it ends.